the Ethiopian Bible is the oldest Bible. The Ethiopian church took all of this literature, which included literature that nobody considered scripture at the time.
There is a Bible that most of the world has never read. Not a fragment, not a rumor, not a fringe theory buried in some obscure corner of the internet. A complete, ancient, sacred scripture, hand-copied by monks for over 1,000 years, written in one of the oldest languages on earth, a Bible containing 88 books, while the one sitting on your shelf has 66. And inside those extra books are words that will make you ask one question you may never be able to shake. What else were we never told? Because here is what those hidden pages contain. They describe what Jesus said and taught during the 40 days between his resurrection and his ascension into heaven. 40 complete days. Not a brief appearance at a tomb, not a flash of light on a road. 40 full days of teachings, warnings, and final instructions, delivered personally to his disciples after defeating death itself. For 2,000 years, the Western world was told that story ended at the empty tomb, that Jesus rose, appeared briefly, and was gone. But in the isolated highland monasteries of Ethiopia, carved into cliff faces, balanced on the edges of mountains, guarded by monks who gave their entire lives to a single sacred task, the rest of the story survived. Tonight, we open those pages, and what they contain will challenge everything you thought you knew about the origins of Christianity and the forces that shaped what billions of people believe. Stay with us, because this is not simply a story about religion. This is a story about power, truth, and what happens when one ancient nation refuses, across centuries, across invasions, across the full weight of history, to let the world forget. The Bible Rome never controlled. Let's begin with a fact that most Christians in the Western world have simply never been taught. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church uses a Bible containing 88 books. The Protestant Bible has 66. The Catholic Bible has 73. But Ethiopia's sacred canon, preserved, copied, and fiercely protected for well over a millennium, goes further than any of them. And here is the detail that changes everything. This is not because Ethiopia added books over the centuries. It is because everyone else took them away. These texts are not recent additions. They are not alternative versions invented by ambitious medieval monks with a political agenda. They are ancient writings composed in Ge'ez, one of the oldest written languages in human history. A sacred liturgical tongue still spoken in Ethiopian churches today, used by a nation that became Christian before the Roman Empire officially adopted the faith as its own. Read that again. Ethiopia was Christian before Rome. So when historians and theologians in the Western world dismiss Ethiopian scriptures as non-canonical or irregular, they are applying a standard invented by an institution that arrived after Ethiopia's faith was already fully formed, fully established, and fully alive. That is not a footnote in the story. That is a seismic fact that reshapes the entire conversation about biblical authority and who gets to decide what is sacred. Now, what exactly is in those extra books? What did Ethiopia preserve that Rome quietly set aside? Among the most significant is a text known as the Book of the Covenant. Ethiopian tradition does not describe this as a piece of spiritual poetry or loose theological commentary. It claims this is a direct record of the actual words Jesus spoke to his disciples during those 40 days after the resurrection, before his ascension. Not metaphors filtered through decades of oral tradition. Not theological interpretations written generations after the fact. Final teachings, direct instructions, sacred warnings about what was approaching on the horizon. There is also the Book of Enoch, filled with detailed visions of angels, the nature of spiritual warfare, and the precise architecture of heaven itself. The Book of Jubilees, offering a rich and detailed accounting of creation and sacred law. The Didaskalia, preserving Jesus' practical instructions on how to live with genuine integrity inside a deeply corrupt world. These texts were not buried in a cave waiting to be accidentally discovered centuries later. They were actively preserved, copied by hand, generation after generation, by monks who believed they were guarding the literal breath of God between leather covers. But here is the question that should be pulling at you right now. If these texts are so ancient, so carefully maintained, and so consistent with the earliest known Christian traditions, why does the Western world know almost nothing about them? The answer to that question takes us back to a single room, a single political moment, a decision made not in a spirit of prayer and discernment, but in a cold, calculated moment of imperial power. The council that changed everything. The year is 325 AD. The Roman Emperor Constantine the Great has summoned church leaders from across the known world to a city called Nicaea. The stated purpose is to settle the theological disputes, tearing early Christianity apart from the inside. But let us be completely honest about what the Council of Nicaea actually was. It was a political assembly as much as a spiritual one. Constantine was not a theologian sitting humbly before God. He was a military emperor who had just brought Christianity under the umbrella of state power. And empires do not celebrate diversity. Empires standardize, empires consolidate, empires decide what people are permitted to believe, and then build institutions to enforce it. The texts that made the final canonical cut were those that supported a centralized church hierarchy, produced clear and manageable doctrines, and delivered narratives that could be controlled and distributed from the top down. And the texts that did not make the cut? The mystical writings, the books overflowing with visions, angelic encounters, and prophetic fire. The scriptures that openly suggested ordinary men and women could connect directly with the living God, without a priest, without a building, without an institution standing between the human heart and the divine. Those texts were pushed out, not because early Christians had carefully examined them and found them false, not because they contradicted what Jesus actually taught, but because they were structurally dangerous to the kind of institution Rome needed Christianity to become. Now sit with what that actually means. Every time you have held a Bible in your hands, every time you have heard Scripture read aloud from a pulpit, you have been receiving a version of Christianity that was curated, deliberately filtered through the decisions of men who answered to an emperor first and to God second. That deserves more than a passing thought. That deserves a long and honest reckoning. And here is what makes Ethiopia's position so extraordinary. Ethiopia never attended that council. Ethiopia was not under Roman jurisdiction. Its mountains and deserts had maintained it as a geographically and politically independent world, sealed off from the imperial machinery that was quietly reshaping Christianity across the Mediterranean. So while Rome was compressing the scriptures down to what served the state, Ethiopia simply kept everything. Every mystical text, every vision of heaven and spiritual war, every teaching about direct, unmediated experience of God, every word that made organized institutional religion optional rather than mandatory. The Ethiopian monks did not preserve these writings as a political act of rebellion against Rome. They preserved them as a pure act of devotion. They believed, genuinely, completely, without reservation, across every generation, that they were guarding the truest and most complete voice of Christ. That what the rest of the world was being handed was an edited, narrowed, institutionally convenient version of a far larger and far more extraordinary story. And now, after 2,000 years, that story is beginning to surface. Are you feeling the weight of this yet? Because what comes next, the actual substance of what Jesus reportedly taught during those 40 days, is the part that the powerful spent 20 centuries hoping you would never encounter. The words Jesus spoke after death. According to Ethiopian sacred tradition, Jesus did not simply materialize at a tomb and then dissolve into the clouds. He stayed. For 40 complete days, he moved between the physical and spiritual realms, preparing his followers not merely for grief and loss, but for a mission that was designed to outlast empires, outlast Rome itself, outlast every power structure that would ever attempt to co-opt his name for its own purposes. During this extraordinary period, the Ethiopian texts describe him sharing what they call the heavenly scrolls, hidden wisdom concerning the nature of ultimate reality, the deeper structure of the human soul, and the specific character of the darkness that was coming. And at the absolute center of this body of teaching is a single idea so radical, so destabilizing to institutional religion, that it explains with total clarity why Rome could never allow it to spread. He taught them that death was not the true enemy. Spiritual blindness was. Consider what that single teaching does to the entire architecture of Western Christianity as most people know it. If physical death is not the primary enemy, if the real war is internal, fought in the territory of consciousness and awareness, rather than at the edge of the grave, then salvation is not fundamentally about what happens to you after you die. It is about whether you are truly, fully awake while you are still breathing. That is not a teaching designed to produce obedient subjects. That is a teaching designed to produce free people. And free people, throughout all of history, are extraordinarily difficult to govern. The Ethiopian texts carry this further. They record Jesus speaking these words directly to his disciples. You build temples of stone and gold, but the real temple lives within you. Every heart that loves is a sanctuary. Every act of kindness is a prayer made flesh. Pause on that for a moment. If the divine genuinely inhabits every human being, not as a theological concept but as a living reality, then what precisely is the function of organized religion as a gatekeeping structure? An inner temple cannot be taxed. A personal and direct relationship with God cannot be monetized or placed behind a paywall. A community of believers who already understand that they carry the sacred within them does not need to purchase access to what they already possess. Do you understand now why these words were removed? Not because they were spiritually weak, but because they were structurally incompatible with the kind of religion that generates institutional power, wealth, and political influence. These words did not need an institution, and that made them the most dangerous words ever spoken. But the Ethiopian texts go still further. Among the most arresting passages in these writings is what can only be described as a prophecy, and it reads not like something written 2,000 years ago, but like a description composed last week. According to these traditions, Jesus warned his disciples that a time would arrive when people would shout his name in the streets while their hearts remained completely empty. They would erect towering churches and fill them with performance, while the simplicity of love died quietly in the background. False leaders would dress themselves in robes of purity while feeding on the poor. His teachings would be systematically reshaped into instruments of control and profit. Families would break apart under the pressure of a world that had stopped knowing what was real. Lies would be packaged as truth and broadcast into every home. And the darkness would spread most aggressively in the very places claiming most loudly to carry his light. Now answer this honestly. Does that sound like ancient prophecy to you? Or does it sound like a precise description of exactly what we are living through right now? How many religious leaders in our lifetime have been exposed in catastrophic scandals while preaching righteousness from stages costing millions of dollars? How many wars in our recorded history have been launched under the banner of Christ? How much wealth has accumulated in church accounts while the people filling those pews cannot afford medicine for their children? If these Ethiopian writings are genuine, if they truly record what Jesus taught after his resurrection, then he did not simply predict this. He warned us with surgical precision, and the institutions that were supposed to be his voice became the very thing he told us to watch most carefully. Perhaps the most quietly shattering line in all of these hidden writings is this, preserved in Ethiopian tradition across more than 1,000 years. Let your silence speak louder than sermons. Let your body become a living prayer. This is not faith as performance. This is not faith as a curated public identity. This is faith as total internal transformation, the complete conversion of how you move through every ordinary moment of your life into something that consistently reflects love. Not love as a sentiment displayed on social media. Love as a daily, embodied, utterly unglamorous practice of treating every person you encounter as genuinely sacred. This is not a Jesus who speaks from a throne surrounded by incense and ceremony. This is a Jesus who speaks from the wilderness, from the margins and the forgotten edges where institutional power has never bothered to look. And for 20 centuries, Ethiopia was the only nation on earth still carrying that voice intact. The prophecy of the forgotten fire. There is one final passage in these Ethiopian scriptures that deserves its own moment before we move forward, because it is the passage that feels least like ancient religious writing and most like a direct message composed specifically for this generation. According to the Ethiopian texts, Jesus told his disciples that when organized religion grows corrupt and hollow, when the institutions constructed in his name forget entirely the people they were created to serve, his Spirit would rise again, not emerging from palaces or cathedrals, not from seminaries or global ministries or television networks with production budgets in the tens of millions, from deserts, from mountains, from the children of those society has enslaved, ignored, and systematically forgotten. My voice will return through those the powerful ignore. Truth will come not from golden pulpits, but from broken hearts that still believe. Read those words again slowly. Let each one settle. Because what Jesus is describing in this passage, if these words are authentic, is a total inversion of the power structure of institutional Christianity. He is saying plainly that the closest expression of God's truth in this world is not the celebrity pastor filling arenas, not the television evangelist with a private jet fleet, not the bishop seated in a gilded chair behind a mahogany desk. It is the person no camera is watching, the quiet believer praying alone in a hospital corridor, the formerly incarcerated man who found genuine faith in a concrete cell and walks out carrying it, the grieving parent who, despite everything, still manages to show up with love for a broken world. That is where the fire burns. That is where it has always burned. And this brings us to the single most striking image in all of these Ethiopian writings. Before his ascension, Jesus is recorded as delivering these exact words: "I am the seed and the sword. I will return, and my fire will awaken those who sleep in darkness." Ethiopian theologians are careful to explain what this fire actually means. It is not a physical catastrophe. It is not the cinematic apocalypse of popular imagination. It is the fire of total spiritual awakening, the kind that does not destroy from the outside but burns from within, consuming everything false until only what is genuinely real remains. Every mask, every carefully constructed lie, every comfortable idol we have placed at the center of our lives in the space where truth was supposed to live. In a world thoroughly saturated with distraction, materialism, manufactured outrage, and the relentless performance of happiness across every screen we own, this prophecy sounds less like mysticism from the ancient world and more like the most accurate diagnosis of our collective condition ever written. We are not struggling because the world has grown too complicated or too fast. We are struggling because we have lost our connection to something real inside ourselves. And according to these Ethiopian texts, Jesus not only predicted that moment, he promised it would be healed. Maybe the return this prophecy points toward has nothing to do with skies splitting open or armies descending on clouds. Maybe it describes something simultaneously simpler and infinitely more demanding. The recognition that the truest form of Christ's teaching, stripped of every layer of empire and politics and institutional profit built on top of it over 2,000 years, is already present, already here, waiting in the silence beneath the noise, waiting for enough people to get still enough, honest enough, and brave enough to hear it again. The question pressing on all of us right now is this: are you ready to actually listen? Why Ethiopia and not Rome? To fully understand how these writings survived while similar texts were erased everywhere else, you have to understand something singular about Ethiopia's place in human history. Ethiopia stands virtually alone among African nations in never having been conquered by European colonial powers. While the rest of the continent was systematically carved up, its institutions dismantled, its cultures deliberately erased, its histories rewritten from the outside, Ethiopia held firm, not by accident or fortune. Through fierce military resistance, extraordinary diplomatic wisdom, and, as most Ethiopians will tell you without hesitation, something that transcends ordinary military calculation entirely. That independence is not merely a point of national pride. It is the direct and irreplaceable reason these scriptures exist for us to discuss today. When European missionaries arrived in other parts of Africa, they came carrying their Bibles and the institutional authority to declare what counted as scripture and what qualified as heresy. They built churches on land they had forcibly claimed. They delivered a version of Christianity that had been shaped by centuries of imperial power and political negotiation. But when they reached Ethiopia, they encountered something they had not anticipated and were entirely unprepared to handle: a Christianity that was already ancient before theirs had fully formed. Ethiopians looked at these newcomers and their thinner Bibles and responded with something approaching polite bewilderment. They had been Christian longer. They had been preserving these sacred texts through more generations than European Christianity had even existed. They already knew what they were doing, and they had the manuscripts to prove it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church traces its spiritual lineage back 3,000 years to the historic union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, whose son Menelik I, according to unbroken tradition, brought the Ark of the Covenant itself from Jerusalem back to Ethiopia, where many scholars and believers alike maintain it remains hidden to this very day inside the ancient city of Axum. When Christianity arrived in Ethiopia in the 4th century, it did not arrive as conquest or imposition. It arrived as recognition, as though the nation had been living in the direction of this truth for centuries before it had a formal name for it. And once it took root in Ethiopian soil, it grew entirely on its own terms, independent of Rome, independent of the political councils reshaping Western Christianity to serve imperial needs, wild and uncontrolled and deeply, fiercely personal. In the remote highland monasteries, in those ancient stone structures perched on cliff edges where the wind sounds permanently like it is trying to say something, monks surrendered their entire lives to one sacred task: copying the words of Christ by hand. Not for recognition, not for wealth, not because the outside world was watching or cared, because they believed with absolute certainty that if a single generation allowed these words to go uncopied, the light they carried would disappear from the earth forever. They prayed, they fasted, they treated each letter as if it carried the literal breath of God. And because of their faithfulness, their quiet, unrecognized, century-spanning devotion, we are having this conversation today. What this means for you? Here is the question this entire story ultimately brings us to. Not a theological question locked inside academic debate, not a historical puzzle for scholars, a deeply, unavoidably personal one. If these Ethiopian texts are authentic records of what Jesus actually taught, if the 40 days between his resurrection and ascension contained radical institution-dismantling wisdom about the divine living inside every human heart, what does that mean for the version of faith most of us were handed? What does it mean that the portions of early Christianity speaking most powerfully about spiritual freedom, direct access to God, the sacredness of the created world, and the complete inadequacy of empty religious performance? were the exact portions removed before most of the world ever had the chance to encounter them. And what does it mean that one nation, isolated, unconquered, stubbornly, and magnificently independent, held on to every single word? Whether you approach these Ethiopian writings as literally true historical documents, as archaeologically significant ancient texts, or as deeply symbolic expressions of a suppressed spiritual tradition, one thing stands beyond reasonable dispute. They represent a form of Christianity that endured entirely beyond imperial control, a faith of edges and mountains and mystics who never submitted, a tradition that looked at the most powerful religious and political institutions in human history and quietly, persistently, across 20 full centuries, kept telling a different and more complete story. A story about a Christ who did not demand your submission and your obedience and your institutional membership, who asked for your total transformation. A story about a God who does not live inside your donation record, your attendance history, or the careful public performance of your piety, but in the honest, unguarded, love-saturated moments of your actual daily life. The Ethiopian writings close with this promise, attributed directly to Jesus: "I am the seed and the sword. I will return." Perhaps that return is not a future event to be feared or calculated. Perhaps it is a present recognition waiting to be made. The recognition that the truest voice of Christ, stripped of every political layer, every imperial compromise, every system ever built to profit from humanity's spiritual hunger, has been alive and present all along. In the silence of monks who never once stopped believing it was worth protecting. In the highlands of a nation that never once surrendered its sacred inheritance. In the pages of a Bible the rest of the world convinced itself it was safe to forget. The forgotten flame never died. It simply waited. For this conversation, for this moment, for people like you, people who still ask the questions that the powerful have always preferred you stop asking. So here is what I genuinely want to know from you today. Do you believe Ethiopia has been guarding lost teachings that could transform how we understand Christianity? Is this a preserved truth that changes everything? Or does it reveal something equally important? Just how much of early Christian thought was deliberately suppressed before most of the world ever had access to it? And what does it mean for your own faith, in whatever form it takes, that the most radical and liberating teachings about spiritual freedom may have been sitting in a mountain monastery you never knew existed? Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. This is precisely the kind of conversation that deserves to be had loudly and without apology. If this story moved you, challenged you, unsettled you, or made you hungry to dig deeper, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who is still brave enough to ask the questions that matter. Because the truth has always existed. It was preserved in forgotten languages, guarded by faithful and anonymous hands, and kept burning in the one nation on earth that understood, from the very beginning, that it was worth every sacrifice to protect. 2,000 years later, we are finally listening.